Commander Park Hana stood in the great assembly hall of Harmony Prime Station and felt the weight of 7 civilizations watching her. Every move through thousands of alien eyes. The massive chamber stretched up into darkness above, while rings of seats held representatives from across the galaxy in a perfect circle that had symbolized equality for over 2,000 years. But today, that symbol felt like a lie waiting to crush her world. High Arbiter Velthek rose from the central platform, and his crystalline form caught the artificial starlight as he began to speak in the harmonic tones that translated into every language known to the Coalition. The words he spoke would echo through history, but in that moment they simply felt like ice forming in Hana's chest as she listened to the casual way he discussed the end of everything she had sworn to protect. The Devourers were coming, and there was no way to stop them. These creatures from beyond the rim of known space consumed entire star systems and left nothing behind but empty void where worlds had once spun in peaceful orbits around their suns. The Coalition had fought them 3 times before and lost every battle while barely managing to drive them back into the darkness between galaxies. Now they returned in numbers that made the previous invasions look like minor raids, and the greatest minds in the Coalition had spent months calculating the odds of survival. The mathematics were simple and terrible. War Chief Granak stood next, and his reptilian features showed none of the emotion that Hana felt building inside her chest as he outlined the military situation with cold precision. The Coalition fleet numbered 40,000 ships of the line supported by twice that many smaller vessels, but the Devourers would arrive with forces that blocked out stars when they moved through space in their endless hunger. Every simulation showed the same result, and even the most optimistic projections gave them perhaps 6 months before the core worlds themselves came under direct assault. Dr. Kim Suho had sent reports from Earth, detailing human research into Devourer technology, but even their most advanced weapons could only delay the inevitable advance. The assembled representatives listened in growing silence as the full scope of the threat became clear to everyone in the chamber. Then High Arbiter Velthek announced the solution that the Coalition Council had approved in secret sessions, while the member worlds continued their normal lives in ignorance of what was being planned for them. The Great Sacrifice Treaty would save the Coalition by offering the Devourers something they wanted more than the core worlds. 18 systems on the outer rim would be abandoned to their fate, and their populations would serve as a distraction, while the essential civilizations relocated to the protected inner regions of the galaxy Earth was third on the list. Hana felt something cold and sharp twist inside her chest as she heard her homeworld mentioned so casually among the expendable territories. President Lee Jae-won had sent her here with clear instructions to represent humanity with dignity, and to remember that humans were still the youngest members of the Coalition. She was supposed to be grateful for the opportunity to sit among civilizations that had mastered space travel when her ancestors were still learning to use fire. The ancient beings around her had created wonders beyond human imagination, and their wisdom had guided the galaxy through countless crises over the millennia. They knew things that humans could not even begin to understand about survival and sacrifice and the harsh mathematics of interstellar politics. But as she listened to them debate the finer points of which worlds would make the best bait for creatures that devoured planets, she found that their wisdom felt like poison in her mouth. The Altarian delegate spoke about the need to maintain genetic diversity among the survivor populations and suggested that human genetic material could be preserved in their archives. The Centauran representative worried about the economic disruption of losing so many resource worlds and proposed a compensation system for the surviving civilizations. They talked about 18 worlds and 40 billion lives like they were discussing crop rotation or trade agreements. Hana thought about the children playing in the parks of New Seoul and the farmers working their fields under alien suns on colony worlds that had taken generations to terraform. She thought about the old veterans who still told stories about the early days when humans had first reached for the stars and found friends waiting among them. Everything her species had built and dreamed and died for would be swept away, so that beings who had lived for thousands of years could continue their ancient existence in safety. The vote was called, and one by one the representatives of the great civilizations announced their approval of the treaty. When they reached Earth's position in the ceremonial order, Hana rose slowly and felt the attention of the assembly focus on her small human form. She was supposed to say yes. The Coalition had made that clear. in 100 subtle ways during the months of preparation for this moment. Humans were too young to understand galactic politics and too emotional to make rational decisions about species survival. Their role was to trust in the wisdom of their betters and accept whatever fate the universe provided with dignity. High Arbiter Veltek extended the signing stylus toward her and waited for her to perform the expected ritual of submission. The chamber was completely silent. Hana looked at the stylus and then raised her eyes to meet the ancient gaze of the being who had just condemned her world to death. She spoke one word that shattered 2 centuries of human diplomacy and sent shockwaves through every system in the galaxy. No, the word hung in the air like a challenge thrown at the feet of God's representatives who had been allies for millennia. Turned to stare at the human who dared reject the collective wisdom of the coalition. War Chief Granak hissed something in his native tongue that the translators rendered as an expression of contempt for species that could not accept necessary sacrifices. The Altarian delegate began to speak about the obligations that membership in the coalition carried, and the need for younger races to trust in established protocols. High Arbiter Veltek's crystalline form darkened with what might have been anger or might have been something far worse. But Hana was no longer listening to their words because she had found something inside herself that was stronger than fear or wisdom, or the weight of 7 civilizations. She began to speak. Her voice carried across the chamber as she told them about a human concept they had never bothered to learn during their centuries of contact with her. Species. She told them about a word that did not translate well into their ancient languages, because it required a kind of courage that they had forgotten in their pursuit of stability and survival. The word was defiance, not the blind rebellion of children against their parents, but the conscious choice of free beings to reject the unacceptable, regardless of the consequences. She spoke about the farmers and teachers and engineers who had volunteered to leave Earth and build new homes on distant worlds because they believed in something worth preserving. She talked about the veterans who had fought in the expansion wars not for conquest or glory, but to protect the right of their children to choose their own destiny. And she told the assembled representatives of 7 ancient civilizations that humanity would not purchase its safety with the blood of innocence, no matter what the cost of refusal might be. When she finished speaking, the chamber erupted into chaos. Some delegates demanded her immediate expulsion from the coalition, while others called for sanctions against Earth for this unprecedented breach of protocol. High Arbiter Veltek restored order with a harmonic tone that hurt human ears and informed Commander Park Hana that her response would be recorded as Earth's official rejection of the Great Sacrifice Treaty. The consequences were immediate and absolute. By ancient law, any member world that refused to honor coalition decisions in matters of galactic security forfeited its right to membership and all associated protections. Earth was no longer part of the coalition. As Hana walked from the chamber, she activated her personal communicator and sent a single message to President Lee Jae-won. The message contained only 3 words, but they would reshape the destiny of every living being in the galaxy. We stand alone. President Lee Jae-won stood before the emergency session of the World Council and watched the faces of humanity's leaders as they processed what Commander Park Hana had just told them through the quantum link from Harmony Prime. The silence stretched across the great chamber in Geneva, while elected officials from every nation tried to comprehend that their species had just been cast out from the galactic community for refusing to die quietly. Some faces showed fear, and others showed anger, but Lee Jae-won saw something else beginning to form in the eyes of people who had spent their lives believing that humanity deserved its place among the stars. He saw the same defiance that had driven Commander Hana to speak that single word that changed everything. Dr. Kim Suho stepped forward from his position among the scientific advisors and activated the holographic display that showed the current state of human knowledge about their new enemy. The Devourers had been studied for 50 years since their first appearance at the edge of Coalition space. But the data remained fragmentary and incomplete. What they knew was simple and terrifying. These creatures existed in vast hive clusters that moved through space like living storms, consuming everything in their path with an efficiency that suggested intelligence beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. Coalition fleets had fought them 3 times and learned that conventional weapons were nearly useless against their ability to adapt and regenerate, but Dr. Kim Suho had discovered something that the Coalition had missed in their panic: to find a diplomatic solution. The Devourers struggled against coordinated quantum-entangled attacks because their hive mind could not process the instantaneous communication that such weapons required. Human neural implant technology had advanced far beyond what the Coalition realized during the decades when Earth was considered a minor member world. Every human military officer carried quantum processors that could link their consciousness directly to ship systems and weapons arrays. The Coalition races had developed their technologies separately over millions of years, and their equipment could not interface with the quantum fields that human brains generated naturally. This meant that only humans could operate the kind of synchronized fleet tactics that might actually damage Devourer formations. Admiral Cho Min-soo took control of the presentation and outlined the military preparations that would begin immediately across every human world. The Earth Defense Fleet would be expanded from 12,000 ships to 50,000 within 18 months using construction techniques that would strip mine the asteroid belts and convert civilian shipyards to military production. Engineer Song Yuri had already designed the first quantum-linked battleships that could be controlled by human crews working in perfect synchronization across light-years of space. But Admiral Cho made it clear that Earth could not face the Devourers alone. The 18 worlds that had been marked for sacrifice included some of the most populated and industrialized systems in the Outer Rim. President Lee Jae-won made a decision that would define humanity's role in galactic history. Commander Park Hana received new orders through the quantum link as she prepared to leave Harmony Prime under the hostile gaze of Coalition security forces. Instead of returning to Earth, she would travel to each of the condemned worlds and offer them something the Coalition had never provided: a choice. The first world she visited was New Kyoto, where 2 billion humans and allied species had built a paradise among crystal forests that grew in the light of twin suns. Governor Yim Haeyeon listened to Hana's message in the Great Assembly Hall, while representatives from a dozen species debated the implications of what they had just learned. The Coalition had not informed the condemned worlds of their fate because they feared panic and disorder would interfere with the evacuation of essential personnel and resources. But Commander Hana told them everything. She explained about the Great Sacrifice Treaty and how their worlds had been selected as acceptable losses in the greater struggle for galactic survival. She described the Devourer threat and the mathematical certainty that the Outer Rim would be consumed within months of the invasion's beginning. And then she offered them humanity's protection. The quantum-linked fleet that Earth was building could defend multiple star systems simultaneously if the local populations were willing to integrate their defense networks with human command structures. It meant trusting their lives to a species that the Coalition had just expelled for refusing to accept rational political decisions. Governor Yim Haeyeon called for a vote that would determine whether New Kyoto would stand with Earth or attempt to negotiate their own survival with the Coalition. The result was unanimous. Every world that Commander Hana visited made the same choice. The Altarian mining colonies voted to join humanity after learning that the Coalition planned to strip their industrial capacity before abandoning them to the Devourers. The research stations orbiting Tau City chose Earth's protection when they realized their scientific data was being quietly transferred to Coalition core worlds. Even the proudly independent traders of the Frontier Exchange agreed to coordinate their defenses with Human Fleet Command within 6 months. 17 worlds had formally withdrawn from the Coalition and declared their allegiance to what they began calling the Free Worlds Alliance. The Coalition's response was swift and predictable. Economic sanctions cut off trade relationships that had existed for centuries, while technological embargoes prevented access to advanced systems that many Outer Rim worlds depended on for basic survival. War Chief Granak announced that any world providing aid to the expelled territories would be considered in violation of Coalition security protocols. But something unexpected began to happen. Individual Coalition worlds started to question whether the Great Sacrifice Treaty represented the values they had spent millennia defending. The crystal beings of Altair Prime broke ranks first by secretly providing industrial equipment to the Alliance worlds. The aquatic civilizations of the Centauran systems began sharing scientific data that helped Dr. Kim Suho refine his anti-devourer weapons. Even some factions within the ancient Veltec hegemony expressed private doubts about the wisdom of abandoning 40 billion sentient beings. High Arbiter Veltec declared these dissenting voices guilty of treason against galactic security and began purging coalition councils of anyone who questioned the treaty. This only accelerated the process, as more worlds began to see parallels between the coalition's treatment of internal dissent and their willingness to sacrifice entire populations. Captain Kang Do-hyun led the first joint human-alien military exercises in the asteroid fields around New Kyoto, as crews from a dozen species learned to operate quantum-linked weapon systems. The training was difficult because non-human nervous systems could not directly interface with the quantum fields. But engineer Song Yuri developed adapter technology that allowed limited coordination. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Mixed crews achieved synchronization levels that approached pure human teams while maintaining the diversity of skills and perspectives that made each species valuable. Admiral Cho Min-soo announced that the Free Worlds Alliance fleet would be the first truly integrated military force in galactic history. President Lee Jae-won addressed the combined populations of the Alliance worlds through quantum communication networks that bypassed coalition monitoring systems. He spoke about the choice that lay before them. They could surrender to the mathematical certainty that the Devourers would consume them regardless of any treaty or negotiation, or they could stand together and prove that courage was more powerful than calculation when the survival of everything they loved was at stake. The response came from 40 billion voices speaking in hundreds of languages but carrying the same message. They would stand Commander Park Hana returned to Earth and found a world transformed by the knowledge that humanity was no longer fighting for recognition or acceptance among the galactic powers. They were fighting for the right of free beings to exist, without permission from ancient authorities who had forgotten what freedom meant. The orbital shipyards above Earth worked around the clock, producing vessels that incorporated technology from 17 different species united by quantum links that only human minds could fully control. Dr. Kim Soo-ho completed his analysis of Devourer weaknesses and confirmed that coordinated quantum attacks could disrupt their hive mind communications, but the window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Long-range sensors detected gravitational anomalies at the edge of the galaxy that suggested the Devourer fleet was larger than previous estimates. War Chief Greenock transmitted a final ultimatum to Earth, demanding that the Alliance world surrender immediately or face consequences beyond the Devourer. Threat President Lee Jae-won's response was broadcast across every system in the galaxy. Humanity had made its choice and would not be moved by threats or promises. The Free Worlds Alliance would defend itself and anyone else who asked for protection, regardless of their previous political affiliation. As Hana stood on the observation deck of the new flagship Unity and watched the combined fleet take formation around Earth, she knew that they were about to face the greatest test in galactic history, but for the first time since leaving Harmony Prime, she felt something that the ancient civilizations had lost in their pursuit of stability. She felt hope. The darkness between stars erupted into fire as the first Devourer scouts emerged from hyperspace 6 months ahead of every coalition prediction and began their systematic consumption of the Kepler mining system. Admiral Cho Min-soo watched the sensor displays from his command ship as impossible numbers of alien vessels poured through dimensional rifts that tore reality apart with their passage. The creatures had evolved beyond the simple hunger that had driven their previous invasions, and now moved with tactical precision that suggested they had learned from their encounters with galactic military forces. Commander Ryu Soyeon coordinated the evacuation of civilian populations, while the combined Free Worlds Alliance fleet moved to intercept the advancing swarm. Her quantum-linked tactical displays showed the movement patterns of individual Devourer ships as they spread through the system like a disease consuming everything in their path. The mining platforms that had produced rare metals for half the galaxy were stripped down to their component atoms within hours of the first contact. Dr. Kim Soo-ho transmitted weapon specifications to every Alliance vessel as they prepared to test human theories against an enemy that had never been stopped by conventional force. The quantum synchronization systems that engineer Song Yuri had designed allowed human crews to coordinate their attacks with perfect timing across light years of space. But theory and practice were different things. When facing an enemy that outnumbered them 1,000 to 1, pilot John Hyok led the first wave of human fighters into the heart of the Devourer formation, while his quantum-linked squadron moved like a single organism guided by shared consciousness on the terrain. Enemy responded with adaptive tactics that had crushed coalition fleets by learning from each attack and developing countermeasures within minutes. But the Devourers had never faced weapons that existed in quantum superposition until the moment they struck their targets. The synchronized assault disrupted the hive mind coordination that made the alien swarm so effective, and for the first time in recorded history, individual Devourer ships began to act independently. Captain Yoon Taemin commanded a mixed crew aboard the converted coalition dreadnought New Harmony and watched as his alien officers struggled to maintain quantum link connections through the neural adapters. The Altarian navigator managed to achieve partial synchronization, while the Centauran weapons officer found that her aquatic nervous system could process quantum data in ways that surprised everyone. Together, they began to develop new tactical approaches that combined human quantum coordination with alien species abilities. The battle raged for 3 days as both sides adapted to enemy capabilities they had never encountered before. The Devourers learned to counter quantum attacks by splitting their hive mind into smaller clusters that could operate independently. Alliance Fleet responded by developing micro-synchronization techniques that allowed individual fighter squadrons to penetrate the alien defensive formations, but the cost was terrible. Half the Alliance Fleet was destroyed in the first day of fighting. While Devourer reinforcements continued to pour through the dimensional rifts, General Nam Woo-jin coordinated ground defenses on worlds that came under direct assault, as Devourer landing forces proved just as adaptable as their space-based counterparts. His integrated human-alien infantry units fought desperate holding actions, while civilian populations evacuated to protected sites. The enemy learned from each engagement, but so did the Alliance forces. They discovered that Devourers could not adapt to tactics that changed constantly, because their hive mind required consistent patterns to develop countermeasures. This led to the development of chaos protocols where Alliance units would deliberately randomize their attack patterns to prevent enemy adaptation. President Lee Jae-won received reports of the battle from his command center on Earth and made the decision that would determine whether the Free Worlds Alliance survived its first real test. He ordered every available ship to the Kepler system regardless of their readiness status or crew training levels. The second wave of Alliance reinforcements arrived just as the Devourer fleet began to overwhelm the remaining defensive positions. Commander Park Hana led the relief force aboard the flagship Unity, while coordinating with quantum-linked commanders across dozens of star systems. The reinforcement fleet included vessels from every Alliance world operating under unified command. For the first time in galactic history, combined assault caught the Devourers at the moment when their adaptive processes were focused on countering the Chaos Protocol's pilot, John Hyok, volunteered for a suicide mission that would target the central coordination node of the enemy hive. His squadron synchronized their quantum fields and dove directly into the heart of the Devourer formation, while broadcasting their final message to every Alliance world. They spoke about the future they were dying to protect, and the choice that every free being had to make when faced with forces that would consume everything. The explosion that destroyed the Devourer mothership sent quantum shockwaves through the alien fleet that disrupted their hive mind connections across the entire system. For the first time in their species' history, the Devourers began to retreat from a battle they were winning. The victory was partial and costly, but it proved that the creatures could be defeated by coordinated resistance. News of the battle spread through both Coalition and Alliance territories with effects that nobody had predicted. Several Coalition worlds that had initially supported the Great Sacrifice Treaty began to question whether abandoning the Outer Rim was necessary. The crystal beings of Altair Prime formally withdrew from the Coalition and requested Alliance protection. The aquatic civilizations of the Centauran systems declared their independence and began integrating their fleets with human quantum command structures. Even some factions within the ancient Velthek hegemony started providing covert support to Alliance research programs. High Arbiter Velthek responded to these defections by declaring martial law across all remaining Coalition territories. War Chief Granach announced that any world providing aid to the Alliance would be treated as an enemy of galactic civilization. But the momentum had shifted. Dr. Kim Suho analyzed the quantum resonance patterns from the battle and discovered that the Devourers were not simply consuming matter for sustenance. They were collecting specific quantum signatures that suggested they were building something that required the unique properties found in inhabited star systems. Engineer Song Yuri used this data to develop new weapons that could target the collection process itself, rather than just destroying individual ships. The implications were staggering. If the Devourers were building something, then they had goals beyond simple consumption. This meant they could potentially be reasoned with, or at least understood in ways that might lead to solutions other than Total War Commander Ryu Soyan coordinated intelligence-gathering operations as Alliance forces began to capture intact Devourer technology. For analysis, the creature's weapons and ships were grown rather than built, using processes that combined organic and quantum mechanical principles. Most surprisingly, the technology showed clear signs of having been modified by multiple different species over long periods of time. The Devourers were not a single race but a collective that had absorbed other civilizations into their hive mind structure. Some of the quantum signatures matched species that had vanished from Coalition records thousands of years ago. This discovery changed everything about how the Alliance understood their enemy. Admiral Cho Min-soo began developing new strategies based on the possibility that some of the consciousness patterns within the Devourer hive mind might still retain individual identity. If they could find ways to communicate with these absorbed civilizations, they might be able to disrupt the collective from within. Captain Kang Do-yun led special operations teams that began attempting to establish contact with Devourer units that had become separated from the main hive mind. The initial results were promising. Isolated Devourer ships showed signs of confusion, and some even stopped their consumption activities when cut off from collective guidance, but the breakthrough came when one of the separated units began transmitting mathematical sequences that matched ancient Coalition scientific protocols. Something inside the hive mind was trying to communicate. Commander Park Hana made the decision to respond to these transmissions despite the risk that it might give the Devourers access to Alliance quantum communication networks. The exchange that followed would reshape understanding of the conflict. The entity that contacted them identified itself as the remnant consciousness of a species that had been absorbed by the Devourers millennia ago. It warned that the collective was building a device that would allow them to consume entire galaxies simultaneously. But it also revealed that the hive mind was not as unified as it appeared. Many of the absorbed civilizations retained fragments of their original identity, and some actively resisted the collective's goals. The war was not just between the Alliance and the Devourers, it was a struggle for the soul of every consciousness that had ever been consumed by the expanding collective, and humanity had just proven that resistance was possible. Dr. Bae-jiwon stared at the quantum resonance patterns flowing across her laboratory screens and realized that everything they thought they knew about consciousness was wrong. The breakthrough had come while analyzing neural data from Alliance crews, who had maintained quantum links with separated Devourer units during the Battle of Kepler. System human brains showed structural changes that persisted long after the links had been severed, and these modifications appeared to be creating permanent connections with non-human consciousness patterns. The implications were staggering. If human neural tissue could adapt to quantum entanglement with alien minds, then the same process might work in reverse. Dr. Bae began developing techniques that could temporarily merge different species' consciousness patterns with human quantum coordinators. The first test subject was Captain Yoon Taemin, who volunteered to attempt a full neural link with his Altarian navigator during a routine patrol mission. The results exceeded every prediction. For 12 minutes, Captain Yoon experienced direct access to crystalline thought processes that operated on temporal scales beyond human comprehension. His Altarian crewmates simultaneously gained the ability to process tactical data at human speed while maintaining the long-term strategic awareness that made her species such effective navigators. Together, they achieved coordination levels that surpassed anything seen in pure human crews. Commander Park Hana authorized expanded testing as reports from the front lines showed that Devourer forces were continuing to adapt to standard Alliance tactics. The enemy had learned to counter chaos protocols by developing multiple parallel adaptation streams that could process random tactical changes, but they had not anticipated that their opponents would suddenly gain access to thought patterns from species they had absorbed centuries ago. The integrated consciousness technique spread rapidly through Alliance fleets as crews from dozens of different species learned to merge their minds with human quantum coordinators. Captain Yoon Taemin found himself commanding mixed crews that could think and fight as unified organisms while retaining the individual skills that made each species unique. His ship New Harmony became the prototype for a new kind of military vessel, where the boundary between crew and vessel dissolved into quantum-linked cooperation. The Coalition leadership watched these developments from their hidden fortress worlds with growing desperation. High Arbiter Velthek convened emergency sessions, as reports showed that more Coalition territories were defecting to the Alliance every day. The ancient civilizations that had maintained galactic order for millions of years found themselves increasingly isolated as younger species chose cooperation over hierarchy. War Chief Granik proposed using planet-killer weapons against Alliance worlds to demonstrate the consequences of defying Coalition authority. But even within the Coalition military command, there was growing resistance to tactics that would make them indistinguishable from the Devourers they claimed to oppose. The breaking point came when the Centauran systems formally declared independence and began sharing their advanced terraforming technology with Alliance researchers. These worlds had provided food production for half the galaxy, and their loss meant that Coalition core worlds would face resource shortages within months. Several Coalition species that had remained neutral began secret negotiations with Alliance representatives. The crystal beings of Altair Prime had already switched sides, but now entire sectors of the ancient Velthek hegemony started providing covert support to human research programs. Dr. Kim Suho used this influx of advanced technology to complete his analysis of Devourer construction patterns. The creatures were building a network of quantum amplifiers that would allow them to consume matter across galactic distances without physically visiting each system. Once complete, the device would make resistance impossible because the Devourers could simply drain the energy from any star system that opposed them. But the construction required specific quantum resonance patterns that could only be generated by conscious minds. This explained why the Devourers absorbed other species rather than simply destroying them. They needed the diversity of thought patterns to complete their ultimate weapon. Engineer Song Yuri realized that the Alliance had an advantage that the Devourers could not duplicate. Human quantum coordination abilities were unique in the galaxy because they had evolved naturally rather than being developed through technology. Every other species relied on artificial enhancement to achieve quantum consciousness effects. This meant that humans could potentially generate quantum patterns that the Devourers had never encountered. General Nam Woo-jin began training integrated ground forces that could maintain quantum links even under the stress of direct combat. His soldiers learned to fight as unified organisms while individual specialists contributed their unique species abilities to the collective effort. The results were demonstrated during the defense of the Tau Ceti research stations, when a massive Devourer assault force attempted to capture the scientific databases. Alliance ground forces held defensive positions that should have been overrun within hours, but quantum-linked coordination allowed them to anticipate enemy movements and respond with tactical precision that made their small numbers irrelevant. The battle became legendary when human soldiers began sharing memories and skills directly with their alien comrades. A human medic gained access to Altarian healing techniques that worked on wounded soldiers from any species. An alien engineer learned human improvisation skills that allowed him to repair damaged equipment using materials that should not have been compatible. Most importantly, they began to understand each other in ways that transcended language and cultural barriers. The quantum links created genuine empathy between species that had spent millennia as distant allies. Counselor Park Min-ji coordinated the political integration of new alliance members as entire coalition sectors abandoned their ancient allegiances. The process required delicate negotiation because many species brought centuries of historical conflicts that threatened to tear the alliance apart. But the shared experience of quantum consciousness created bonds that proved stronger than old resentments. Species that had been enemies for generations found themselves working together with unprecedented cooperation. The climactic test came when Devourer forces launched their largest offensive yet against the Coalition's former capital. World High Arbiter, Velthek, transmitted a desperate plea for alliance assistance despite having declared humanity an enemy of galactic civilization. President Lee Jae-won faced a choice that would define the moral character of the Free Worlds Alliance. They could allow the Coalition capital to fall and eliminate their primary political opposition, or they could prove that their commitment to defending all sentient life was genuine, regardless of previous hostilities. The decision was unanimous across all Alliance worlds. Commander Park Hana led the largest fleet in galactic history to defend beings who had tried to sacrifice her homeworld. The battle that followed involved over 1 million ships from 40 different species, all coordinated through quantum links that connected their consciousness into a unified fighting force. For the first time in the war, the Alliance achieved total synchronization across an entire star system. Every weapon fired at the perfect moment, while every defensive maneuver was coordinated with mathematical precision. The Devourer assault force was larger than anything they had faced before, but they had never encountered resistance that operated as a single organism. Dr. Bae-ji-won monitored the quantum resonance patterns from her laboratory and realized that they were witnessing the birth of a new form of consciousness. The quantum links were no longer just tactical tools. They were creating permanent changes in how the participating species understood themselves and their relationship to other forms of life. Captain Yoon Taemin reported that his crew was beginning to think of themselves as components of a larger organism, rather than separate individuals. This did not diminish their individual personalities, but enhanced them by providing access to perspectives and abilities they could never have developed alone. The implications were profound. If consciousness could expand beyond the boundaries of individual minds, then the concept of species loyalty became meaningless. What mattered was not whether someone was human or alien, but whether they chose cooperation or domination. The battle raged for 72 hours as both sides pushed their capabilities to the absolute limit. Alliance forces saved the Coalition capital, but at enormous cost. Half their fleet was destroyed and thousands of quantum-linked crew members suffered permanent neural damage from maintaining synchronization under extreme stress. But they had proven something that would reshape the future of galactic civilization. Different species could become more than allies. They could become a single people united by shared consciousness and common purpose. The war was far from over. The Devourers still possessed overwhelming numerical superiority, and their ultimate weapon was nearing completion, but the Alliance had discovered something that gave them hope. They were no longer fighting just to survive. They were fighting to prove that consciousness could evolve beyond the primitive drive to consume and dominate, and in the quantum-linked minds of 1 million different beings, a new kind of civilization was being born. The main Devourer fleet arrived at Earth like a storm that blocked out the stars, and Commander Park Hana stood on the bridge of the flagship Unity, watching sensors that could barely process the scale of what approached her homeworld. Over 10 million vessels moved in perfect formation, while reality itself bent around their passage as they prepared to consume the system that had dared to defy their ancient hunger. President Lee Jae-won coordinated the evacuation of non-essential personnel while Admiral Cho Min-soo positioned the surviving Alliance fleet in defensive formations that everyone knew would delay the inevitable for perhaps hours. The quantum-linked consciousness that connected Alliance crews across dozens of species carried a mixture of determination and fear as they prepared for humanity's final stand. But Dr. Kim Soo-ho had made a discovery in the ruins of consumed worlds that changed everything. The scientist had spent months analyzing quantum resonance patterns from systems that the Devourers had completely stripped of matter and energy. What he found defied every assumption about their enemy's nature and purpose. The creatures were not invaders seeking to expand their territory or resources. They were refugees, fleeing from something that had destroyed their home dimension. The consumption of inhabited worlds was not motivated by hunger, but by desperate need for the specific quantum signatures that conscious minds produced. They were building a bridge between realities using the collective consciousness of absorbed civilizations, but the process had become corrupted over eons of continuous consumption. The Devourers had forgotten their original purpose and become addicted to the act of absorption itself. They no longer remembered that they had once been individual species fleeing cosmic catastrophe. Dr. Beiji-Wan studied the neural patterns of Alliance crew members who had maintained quantum links with separated Devourer units and realized that communication was possible. The consciousness fragments trapped within the hive mind could be reached if someone was willing to risk direct mental contact, but the attempt would require a quantum link so deep that failure would mean the complete absorption of the volunteer's consciousness. Commander Park Hana volunteered without hesitation. She had spent her career making impossible choices, and this was simply the final decision in a series that had brought them to this moment. The quantum link was established. As the Devourer fleet began its final approach to Earth, Hana felt her consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of her human identity and touch minds that had been trapped for millennia. She found herself connected to species that had once been free civilizations before the Devourers consumed their worlds. Many had resisted absorption for generations before finally succumbing to the collective hunger. But fragments of their original nature remained hidden within the hive mind. Through these consciousness remnants, Hana began to communicate with the core intelligence that directed the Devourer collective. What she discovered was a tragedy that spanned cosmic time. The original species had fled their dying dimension as reality itself collapsed around them. They had intended to find refuge in this galaxy and coexist peacefully with existing civilizations, but the trauma of dimensional collapse had shattered their unity and turned their survival mechanism into an endless cycle of consumption. They had absorbed other species not from malice, but from a desperate need for the quantum patterns that could stabilize their existence. Over time, the process became automatic and they lost the ability to distinguish between cooperation and consumption. Hana showed them something through the quantum link that the Devourers had forgotten was possible. She demonstrated how different species could share consciousness without destroying individual identity. The Alliance had learned to merge minds while maintaining the unique perspectives that made each species valuable. Cooperation did not require consumption, as the quantum connection deepened more. Alliance volunteers joined the link. Despite the risk of mental absorption, Dr. Beiji-Wan connected her consciousness to the growing network, while Captain Yoon Taemin brought the integrated awareness of his mixed-species crew. General Nam Woo-jin added the tactical coordination that his quantum-linked ground forces had developed. 1,000s of Alliance personnel opened their minds to direct contact with the enemy. They showed the trapped consciousness fragments within the Devourer hive mind. What they had learned during months of species integration, different forms of awareness could enhance each other without requiring the destruction of individual identity. The quantum resonance patterns that the Devourers needed for dimensional stability could be generated through willing cooperation rather than forced absorption. But the demonstration required proof. Commander Park Hana made the ultimate sacrifice by fully opening her human consciousness to merger with the Devourer collective. The quantum link expanded to encompass minds from both sides of the conflict as she showed them through direct experience what cooperation meant. Her human determination merged with crystalline patience from Altarian consciousness, while Centauran emotional depth combined with Velthec strategic thinking. The resulting hybrid awareness was more than the sum of its components. It possessed capabilities that none of the individual species could achieve alone. Most importantly, it retained the essential characteristics that made each consciousness unique. The merged awareness began to spread through the Devourer hive mind as absorbed consciousness fragments remembered what they had been before consumption. Ancient civilizations that had been trapped for millennia started to reassert their individual identities while maintaining connection to the collective. The hive mind began to fragment, but instead of chaos, this created a new form of organization. The Devourers became a true collective where different consciousness patterns worked together by choice rather than compulsion. The change was not immediate or complete. Much of the hive mind remained locked in consumption patterns that had been reinforced over cosmic time, but enough consciousness fragments achieved liberation to begin negotiating with the Alliance. The entities that had once been the original species transmitted a proposal through the quantum link. They would cease their consumption of inhabited systems in exchange for Alliance assistance in stabilizing their dimensional refugee crisis. The quantum patterns they needed could be generated by willing volunteers from Alliance species working in cooperation. Rather than through forced absorption, Dr. Kim Soo-ho confirmed that the Alliance possessed the technical capability to help stabilize the dimensional bridge without requiring the destruction of entire civilizations. But the project would require unprecedented cooperation between species that had been mortal enemies for generations. President Lee Jae-won addressed the combined populations of Alliance and coalition worlds through quantum communication networks that now connected most of the galaxy. The choice before them was simple but profound. They could continue fighting a war that would destroy both sides regardless of who achieved military victory, or they could work together to solve the underlying crisis that had created the conflict. The response came from across the galaxy, as species that had spent millennia in isolation chose cooperation over continued separation. Even the ancient coalition leadership recognized that their political structures were obsolete in a galaxy where consciousness could transcend species boundaries. High Arbiter Veltek formally dissolved the coalition and requested inclusion in the expanded alliance that was emerging from the crisis. The Dimensional Stabilization Project took 5 years to complete, as hundreds of species contributed their unique capabilities to solving problems that none could have handled alone. The Devourer Collective was transformed into a confederation of liberated consciousness patterns that maintained connection through choice rather than compulsion. Many of the absorbed species chose to remain merged with others in new forms of hybrid awareness that transcended their original limitations. Others separated back into individual identities, but retained the ability to connect with the greater collective when needed. Commander Park Hana emerged from the quantum link, permanently changed by her merger with multiple forms of consciousness. She had become something new that was simultaneously human and more than human. Her expanded awareness could process information and make decisions at speeds that exceeded any individual species' capability. But she retained the essential human characteristics of curiosity and compassion that had made her willing to sacrifice everything for others. The formal establishment of the new Galactic Confederation took place on Earth as representatives from thousands of worlds, and dimensional refugees worked together to create governing structures based on voluntary cooperation. Commander Hana was elected as the first Coordinator General, not because she was human, but because her quantum-linked consciousness could communicate effectively with all member species. The old boundaries between ally and enemy dissolved as beings learned that cooperation was more powerful than competition. The Confederation's first major project was the launch of exploration missions to other dimensions and galaxies. These expeditions were crewed by quantum-linked volunteers from multiple species working together to contact other civilizations and offer them the choice between cooperation and isolation. The success of these missions proved that the principles they had learned during the crisis could be applied on a cosmic scale.